Good, let's start. Welcome everyone to our discussion today. I am Celine, joining in from Zurich in Switzerland. I work with the business development teams at Climeworks, the direct air capture company, and I'm very happy to be your host today. We have a few agenda points before we jump in the topic. This session is being recorded for your information, and we'll start with some introductory remarks by our guest. Then we'll head into the discussion, and finally we'll have time for your questions. There is a Q&A tool that you can use in the Zoom webinar that you're online. And you can enter your questions directly and also vote up for the questions that you think are interesting and relevant. So don't hesitate to do that so we can address them. Today, we're here to speak about the need for carbon dioxide removal solutions to reach global climate targets and about the necessity of creating standards and norms in the market. Companies and governments are increasingly relying on these solutions to remove parts of their emissions or even entirely their unavoidable emissions. And in this development, there is an increasing need for data and transparency to understand what actually lies behind these individual solutions. To speak about this, we have the honor of being joined by an expert in the field, Jeremy Freeman, founder and executive director of CarbonPlan. CarbonPlan is a nonprofit organization whose mission is improving the transparency and scientific integrity of carbon dioxide removal and climate solutions through open data and tools. A few words about Jeremy's background. He has a PhD in neuroscience and spent the first decade of his career working on computational tools for understanding the brain and biology. During this time, he became increasingly concerned about climate change and started thinking about how the tools and values of open science, which he knew so well, could be pointed towards this daunting challenge. And CarbonPlan was exactly formed around that vision. Jeremy is joining us today from close to San Francisco. Welcome, Jeremy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Celine. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate that introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. How are you?
I am doing really well. Yeah, it's a bright early morning over here. Realize it's a lot later over there.
Yes, absolutely. We're ending the day, but that's the nice thing. Very good. So we're very, very happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks. And I would say the floor is yours for your introductions.
Wonderful. All right. Well, yeah, I'm going to do put up my slides here, folks, and do a very quick introduction to what CarbonPlan is. Celine said it perfectly, so I'm just going to say a little bit more and show some demos, and then I think we're going to have a great conversation. Let me share my screen. All right. Assume folks can see this. Tell me if you can't. And yeah, good morning to everyone on the call here. It's great to be here and great to be sharing some of our work with you. I'm going to give a bit of an intro just to kind of who we are and what we do. So exactly as Celine said, we are a nonprofit focused on the scientific integrity and transparency of climate solutions through open data and tools. We've been around for a little over a year now. And in our first year, we've really been quite focused on carbon removal and carbon offsets and exploring these issues in those areas. As we grow, we might start to expand into other areas as well. We do that and work on that mission in three main ways. The first is research. We do deep dives into different areas of climate solutions science and different carbon removal science. And then we try to put a lot of what we learned together into syntheses that take a variety of forms. All of it comes out in the form of open source tools that includes data and software and web articles and all other kinds of content. So that's the first thing we do is research. Second is communication. We put a lot of effort into trying to explain technical concepts and really complex concepts in a way that sort of the right audiences can understand them. And we also try to provide timely commentary on newsworthy events. And some of that has involved working quite closely with journalists that are trying to cover these very kind of scientifically and technically complex issues. And the third thing is engagements. So we are very involved in thinking about how to evaluate both individual projects as well as policies and different kinds of programs. I want to be clear here, we're a nonprofit. So sometimes we do work with entities, including corporate entities, but also organizations in the public sector. For us, we want to help those organizations, but we want to ultimately help them do things that are in the interest of the climate. So sometimes we call this activist consulting, where we want to help folks, but we also want to make sure ultimately that the highest quality, best possible outcomes for the climate are what we are all collectively pursuing. Another thing to highlight about really our approach across the board is that we are very committed to and passionate about doing our work in the open. And for us, that means some very specific things. So all of our code for all of our tools and data projects and research projects it's all on GitHub. I have some links up there, both to our GitHub website as well as our main website. And every website we put up, every research article we put up, every number is traceable back to some piece of public data that either we found or that we analyzed and prepared. And that for us is what transparency means. It's about showing what's behind everything you're claiming. And it's a challenge, and it's certainly a challenge in this field, but it's something that we're really committed to. And we also love working in the open because it's a way to draw the community in broadly to our work and get feedback on our work, and hopefully keep doing these things better as we learn from the community what we've done and if we've made mistakes, which we always want to fix. So it's been a real commitment of ours and something we absolutely will keep doing. What I'll do now is just kind of show you demos basically of a couple tools and resources that we've built that I think are relevant to the conversation we're going to be having, just as something to have on your mind, and maybe that could inform the conversation Celine and I are about to have. So let me switch to showing you a couple demos. So the first thing is something we maintain called our Cdr Database. And this is a resource we've built by analyzing carbon removal projects that have been proposed through public RFPs. So as folks maybe know, and I think we're definitely gonna be talking about, a handful of companies have run basically public requests for proposals where they have carbon removal projects apply. And in the process, those companies, in particular Stripe and Microsoft, have ensured that all those proposal materials be made public, which I think is an awesome step forward in terms of transparency. And making those proposals public has allowed us to then analyze them and assemble this database that we've built. So it's both literally data you can download, but also this interactive browser. And what we're seeing here are projects that have proposed carbon removal in different settings. And each one we have, there's Climeworks, we have a lot of materials for. There's also things that we can learn about these projects independently. And what we've done at CarbonPlan is analyze these proposal materials and try to represent them in terms of several different metrics that capture different aspects of the project. And I won't go into too much detail here because I think these are things we're going to be talking about during the chat. But the goal is to try to explain and sort of quantify projects along lots of different dimensions. And then what we do at CarbonPlan is we try to validate this information. So I want to be clear, we're not out there putting meters on pipes and sort of doing field visits. There's a need for that. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is trying to ask, the numbers, the claims that projects are making, do they make sense and hold up given a lot of other information we can find, either basic science, published papers, existing resources, existing things from the projects, does it all check out? So quite literally that involves putting check marks on things. And then we also come up with an overall rating on a scale of 1 to 5 that we use to try to give some sense of again, how kind of valid the claims of these different projects are. And the whole thing is interactive. You can explore it. You can threshold by the number of check marks. You can switch by category to look at only some categories. Obviously, a lot more forest and soil projects than the others. And you can also filter by different dimensions like volume and permanence. So I think we're going to talk about a lot more about both maybe this, but also just more general issues that we've certainly learned in doing this work. But I want to call this out as a resource we produced, again, fully public. It's based on public information, and the database itself is publicly available for anyone to use however they like. So that's one example. That's a pretty involved resource that we've built. We also do a lot of work that takes the form of kind of smaller tools and resources that we want to put out to explain complicated concepts. So this is an example of something called our Permanence Calculator. I should say all of these are easy to find if you just go to carbonplan.org/research. They're all there. So the Permanence Calculator is something we built to try to get collectively get our heads around the issue of permanence with carbon removal, which again, I think we're going to talk more about. But just to highlight what we've done here is build a tool that tries to help people think through sort of the really simple economics of what it means to do carbon removal that has different permanence timelines, whether short-term or long-term. For anyone that's ever tried to find a place to live, in the form of an apartment or a house, it's kind of similar to that. And in fact, the New York Times once put out an interactive on, when should you rent or buy a house? A lot of analogies to this. And the basic idea is that we have different carbon removal projects that have different permanence horizons. Some are short, maybe 10 years, 20 years. Some are really long, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And projects also have different costs. And what this calculator tries to do is explain how to think about normalizing cost based on permanence. In particular, if you have a project that is, say, $20, but it only lasts 10 years, then you need to think about the fact that to achieve actually permanent benefits to the climate, you need to do that project multiple times. But there could be, and this is a parameter in the model, a discount applied to future costs. And if you roll all that together, you find out that that $20 per ton project is actually closer to $115 per ton in terms of the amount that you need to budget today. And what the calculator does, because we of course can't know any of these numbers, is it just lets you explore this. So you can kind of ask how these parameters, things like discount rate, affect the results. You can see all manner of interactions. It gets quite complicated if you want. You can change the relative cost of permanent and temporary removal and create cost curves. Anyway, there's a lot to play with. But again, the highlight here is this is us trying to put out public materials that help all kinds of folks, the public at large, but maybe especially companies that are exploring this space, help think about and understand these issues, and hopefully make decisions based on scientific integrity. So that's an example of a smaller tool. This is one a little more involved and specific to the kind of quote unquote natural, or we usually say biological carbon removal. This is a tool we built to explore risks associated with forest carbon. So, again, on this theme of permanence, a big issue with forest carbon is the fact that things like fire, as well as drought and insects, pose risks to the carbon. It does not last forever. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about these projects, but it means we have to be really careful and thoughtful about how we model, understand, and manage that risk and incorporate it into our plans. So what we've done here is build a resource where we've used the latest generation of climate models to project future risk associated with fire, drought, and insects, and put it together in an interactive browser that lets you explore those risks under different warming scenarios and also under over different timeframes. This is currently for the United States only, continental United States only, largely due to availability of a certain kind of forest-related data that we use to do this particular version of the model. We're very much starting to explore doing this kind of work more globally. And this tool lets you kind of see all these risks. You can bring in also the risks associated with insects and drought, which are a major issue, especially in the Western United States where I live. And you can see it at various scales and see it over time. It is deeply concerning, the degree to which fire risk, in particular in the West of the United States, is not only extremely high now, as we've been experiencing in the last several years, but is likely to grow substantially in the future. And we think that says something important about where forest projects might take place, and how we think about managing the risk associated with these projects in different locations. The tool also lets you kind of zoom around and get statistics in particular areas, and then again, see kind of how things change over time under different warming scenarios, as well as under different time periods. So again, fully public, and this is very much a work in progress. There are a lot of folks that have done very serious work modeling forest biomass potential, as well as modeling these risks. This is not to say we've solved that problem. It's a very hard problem. This is us putting out a resource that we think is useful on this topic, and we're excited to keep working on these problems because they are far from solved. The last thing I want to highlight, also on the topic of forests, which is an area that we've gone quite deep into, we've been doing a lot of work around forest offsets, and in particular, we've done a sort of deep dive analysis of the California Cap and Trade program and the forest offsets in that program. And this is a tool we put together to sort of visualize all the projects in that program. Again, this is a program that, while run through California, includes projects across the continental United States. It is, all these projects are in the United States. And this, again, is a tool that lets you browse and see different projects and their locations. And what we focused on in this particular research project was both assembling and digitizing all the information about all of these forest offset projects, but also using ecology data to identify and unfortunately show that a large fraction of the carbon credits that these projects received were effectively fake with respect to the actual climate benefits the projects achieved because of how baselines were set. That is, the baseline carbon levels that the projects were compared to. And I can say a lot more about that specific issue, but we think it's a really important example of the fact that when it comes to offsets and existing systems for these things, a lot of things aren't working, and we need to really understand that and be clear about it. This particular piece of work was covered in a story, pair of stories by ProPublica and MIT Tech Review by James Temple and Lisa Song, two fantastic reporters that I'd recommend checking out. So that's something to dig into. We may talk about that more here on the call as well. And I hope that shows, what we try to do is we just try to analyze everything. And sometimes, we hope that produces tools that help us all collectively think better about how to approach these solutions. Sometimes we find examples of things that aren't working. It's our belief that that's a good thing because we don't have time to do things that don't work, and we need to make progress on things that do. So we try to put all that material out and hopefully help us all move forward. I think with that, let's chat.
Great, thank you so much. Jeremy, I think your video is frozen. If you could just turn your camera off and on. I think we lost you.
Oh no, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Very good, and now I can see you. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. It's actually really great to see you play around the tools, because the tools are also tools that we're using on a day-to-day basis at Climeworks. And for example, the Permanence Calculator, it's something that I also use in my conversations with potential customers. So you're already having an impact just by putting these available out there. So very nice. But before diving into the details, I have, of course, a few questions for you, and I want to address the more general question of why do we need this carbon dioxide removal? Why are these solutions so important? What is your view on that?
Yeah, great question to start with, and a really important one. So it's something we've actually thought a lot about quite recently, and maybe a place to start is that probably a lot of folks on the call here, and often we all sometimes talk about the need for carbon dioxide removal as being really, really high. We often hear numbers like 10 to 20 gigatons, which is an unbelievably enormous amount of carbon dioxide removal. And those numbers, they come mainly from integrated assessment models and parts of the IPCC report. They're absolutely massive. And what I want to be really clear about for this audience is that those numbers reflect very specific assumptions about future decarbonization scenarios and potential costs and opportunities in both decarbonization and mitigation and CDR. And they're not necessarily truth, and they could carry certain moral hazards. Really anything that convinces us that we don't need to be moving as fast as possible on mitigation and decarbonization is a concern. So as a sort of counter to those numbers, folks, I definitely welcome you to check out a resource that we were very involved in, many others were involved as well, called the Cdr Primer. That's at cdrprimer.org. And in chapter 1 of the Cdr Primer, the authors of that chapter, Andrew Bergman and Toli Ringberg, walk through a really different calculation where they look at a very aggressive decarbonization scenario and show that even in that scenario, there are really hard to avoid or hard to abate emissions coming from things like agriculture, in transportation. And even in that situation, if you assume really aggressive decarbonization, you end up with about 1.5 to 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal per year that would need to be done. That's really different than 10 to 20. I want to stress that's also really, really big. So, we're not, and obviously folks at Climeworks know this, we're not at megatons right now. Getting to 1.5 to 3 gigatons a year is an enormous amount of carbon dioxide removal. So this is an important, I wouldn't say this issue is resolved. I would say that, saying that we need 10 to 20 is something I'd be very careful about. Saying that we, do need at least a lot, I think we can all feel confident about. And even at that smaller scale, we need to be pushing for this. And there's an enormous amount of need now for research, growth, and serious action to put us on track to be doing that volume of CDR, say, over the next 30 years. So we definitely need it. We need it at a very large scale. We might not need as much as some folks have claimed, and there are some things to be careful about in terms of what saying we need that amount of CDR does to our other efforts around mitigation, which we absolutely need to be doing full stop.
Yeah. There are indeed different scenarios out there. Even in the IPCC itself, there are different models and different scenarios to calculate that. The question isn't how much can we actually decarbonize and how can we reduce the emissions. So that's a whole webinar in itself. So that's for the next time.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. Very complicated. Always. Yeah. I just try to always think about when anyone gives me a number, what are the assumptions underlying that number? What model has been run?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's exactly the job you do, right? Working with data and analyzing it to the little bit. Yeah, very good. So also a quite general question: what different carbon dioxide removal solutions actually exist beside direct air capture, where we know about direct air capture?
Absolutely, of course, yeah. So yeah, there are a lot. I both think we've seen almost all of them. I hope there's new things that we haven't seen yet that are still to be invented. So of course there's direct air capture, there's mineralization and various forms of enhanced mineralization. Those are generally I'd put on the sort of technological side. And then of course there's CDR involving biological systems, forests and soils, and sort of changes to land management. Lots of projects, and actually we're seeing more and more projects involving the ocean that both include sort of biological systems in the ocean, as well as technological and sort of things that leverage ocean chemistry, for example. I also think there's new ideas out there that probably we haven't seen yet and haven't heard about. Yeah.
So there's a wide variety actually. So it's really, you mentioned these technological solutions and then nature-based solutions, but we'll go back to that afterwards.
Yeah.
And coming back to CarbonPlan's really mission statement about improving the transparency and scientific integrity of these solutions. You mentioned in your presentation the challenge that there is to really bring this data and make it available. Why is it such a challenge? Why is this transparency not given today?
Great question. Yeah, lots to say. So part of it is that, a lot of what we're looking at here is an existing system that just hasn't really worked. So here I'm really describing the existing system of carbon offsets. And that includes a whole, bunch of factors and different entities and practices, but collectively, I think we're all waking up to the fact that, there are big problems with the current market, and the sort of status quo of the existing market and the existing registries are not working and not delivering high quality offsets, period. There's an enormous amount of kind of fake credits. Why we don't have it, it's why it's been hard to figure that out, and why there's not a lot of data on a lot of these issues. I think it's a whole bunch of things. One is that you have this, especially now, this wide diversity of methods, and it's not at all straightforward to know what kinds of data need to be acquired to look at these different approaches. Going really deep into any one of these areas requires often pretty sophisticated domain expertise. The work we did analyzing the forest offsets in the California program, we had some phenomenal forest ecologist collaborators working. The project was led by a forest ecologist named Grayson Badgley, who had spent 10 years thinking about forests and how to measure them, and how to think about issues with how baselines might be calculated. That's really deep domain expertise, and you sort of need that in any of these areas. And obviously, you know that about doing work in direct air capture. So I think that level of domain expertise is a barrier to get into any of these areas. And I also think there's been no or very little standardization, and there's been very little push or requirement around transparency of information. There's been neither sort of proper regulation or proper requirements around disclosures for anything. It's very much sort of the Wild West in terms of what companies that are, say, in the voluntary market procuring carbon removal need and ask for, what information they solicit. It's kind of arbitrary right now. Yeah. And then what companies are providing is kind of up to them. So I think we're seeing a lot of good faith efforts, and we're seeing folks really trying to do the right thing. We're also seeing a lot of stuff that's fake and not working, and where the data doesn't check out. And I think you have a combination of really complicated problems and complicated areas of data and science, and you have a lack of standards and a lack of requirements, and you have a lot of people trying to make money. And those things don't always go so well together. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, as you say, there are at the moment actually many initiatives which push for the development of these standards with the SBTi, with the discussions coming up also to the next COP at the end of this year. So hopefully these are things which will also come into play, and the data that you're putting available, I think, or I can imagine, will also be very useful for these upcoming conversations. I hope so. I mean, I think, yeah, definitely there's a lot of folks starting to talk about all these issues more. I think the thing we look out for is anyone, whether it's a new group trying to work on standards or a company trying to do better, or a new guideline, it has to start from a recognition of what has not worked in the past. And I think we're seeing certain folks really grappling with that and sort of saying from the outset, what we're doing right now is not working. Here's a path to improve the situation. That's a place to start from. To not recognize the issues with quality and what's out there now, and to sort of pretend we can just scale it up without fixing these fundamental issues of quality, that's a concern. So that's, at least for us, the thing to really look out for is, are we really wrestling with and grappling with the problems of what of how these systems have worked so far? Yeah, really addressing the key issues that there are. And I can imagine also with all these different initiatives being initiated, it's the question, you mentioned the standardization, it will be also about standardizing the standards. Not that there are so many initiatives out there in the end that companies, governments are a bit also maybe lost and trying to find their way among all these different rules, so to say. Yep. And being careful about, I think conflicts of interest are really important here. Certainly anyone who comes from the financial sector knows about the importance of having standards that are sort of financially disinterested. And it's been an issue with the current market and something to be really careful about. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good. So I'd like to move on to one other part of the discussion, the assessment criteria that you use. So you showed us this database. Can you elaborate a bit about these criteria that you use to evaluate the different carbon removal projects? Yeah, definitely. And I should really stress it's a work in progress. And as we've just been saying, this is very complicated. So what we try to do is break a project down or proposal down into several metrics. And that includes metrics around the basic mechanism of the project. Is it carbon removal or is it avoided emissions? That's a really important one to start with, because a lot of things out there claim, well, it's complicated. Some claim to be one when they're actually the other. Some are doing one now, but could do the other in the future. So if I have concrete, a system that incorporates CO2 into concrete production, today I might be using waste CO2 streams to achieve that. That's an avoided emission. In the future, I could use direct air capture and atmospheric CO2 to do the same thing. That would be carbon removal. So it's totally possible to do one now and the other in the future. But it's something we should be very clear about, because it matters a lot from an accounting standpoint. So that's one key dimension, is just, what are you doing? Sounds easy, but it's actually pretty hard to figure that out sometimes. And then there's sort of key dimensions that we try to figure out, like the volume of the project, just how many tons of CO2 are you removing or avoiding, if that's actually what you're doing. And then the permanence, how durable is it? How long will the carbon stay trapped? Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 100,000 years? That's a really important one. I think we might come back to that. Another really critical one is additionality. So this is the idea of assessing whether a project is doing something that wouldn't have happened otherwise, but for paying for either the project or the offset or the credit. It's one of those things that's so hard to get your head around, because you're literally asking what would have happened in this counterfactual world where I didn't give the project money. It's really weird, but it's so important, because it can be often the main thing that determines whether the money that we're giving to these programs and projects is having any effect on the climate at all, as opposed to literally doing nothing. So that's a key one. What we try to do is look at all these numbers and all these different metrics. We try to validate them, which again doesn't mean going out into the field and sort of making measurements. That's important, and to do all of this correctly at some point, someone needs to do that. So we're not doing that now. What we do is try to figure out, does everything make sense given all the information we have available, whether could be anything from satellite data of forests to project documentation to sort of published papers on life cycle analysis and sorbent properties, everything in between. We try to figure out, did the numbers make sense? Does this check out? And then we have a rating system that we use that tries to capture all of that on a scale from 1 to 5.
So you mentioned the additionality. I'm interested to dig a bit here. Do you have an example of where you thought, okay, additionality is not given at all here, or where it was really clear that additionality was actually given? Can you share an example?
Yeah, great question. Helps to make it concrete. So, unfortunately, a lot of the issues with problems of additionality do come up and this is not to say these kinds of projects are inherently impossible, but a lot of forest projects that involve changes to management of changes to existing management practices. So this is the scenario of someone who owns land that says, in exchange for money, for carbon credits or carbon offsets, I was gonna cut the trees down, but I'm not gonna cut them down because you paid me. Or I was cutting them down every 20 years, but now I'm gonna cut them down only every 30 years, and therefore there'll be more CO2 pulled in from the atmosphere. The trees are capturing carbon. That part is absolutely true. The question is whether those land management practices claimed the things the projects say they were going to do, but for the payment, is that really what they were going to do? And I'd recommend readers here or viewers check out. There's some really, really powerful and impressive and compelling stories from Bloomberg over the last several months since December. And also the story we were helped provide information for from MIT Tech Review and ProPublica. James Temple and Lisa Song put out two big stories recently that really get into these issues and go through individual examples and specific cases of projects that if you read all around it and you really think about what was actually going to happen in the absence of this project, it kind of looks like they weren't going to cut the trees down. So no one should be claiming credit for changing someone's behavior if they were going to do it anyway. So that's an example of additionality, of a low score on additionality. Positive forms of additionality, it's interesting. Sometimes it simply happens because the projects are so expensive. So in general, a project that is so expensive, for a project where there's no reason to do it except for carbon removal and it's really expensive, we usually feel pretty confident. You can never be totally sure, but you can usually feel pretty confident that that's additional because there's no other reason to pay that money except for the fact that it's achieving carbon removal, because nobody would just randomly give that kind of volume of money. So it generally is the case that, and this is not to say they're inherently better, but it is often the case that sort of more expensive, more technologically complicated forms of carbon removal tend to be more additional, but of course one always has to check and read around it to make sure.
Yeah. Thank you. That was very, very interesting and clear. And to the criteria of permanence, that's a very important criteria. You mentioned it. You developed a tool around it.
Yep.
And my understanding is that it's even more important when comparing nature-based solutions to technology solutions. Can you say a few words about that, and why is this so important? And also maybe with regards to the tool that you have developed, what kind of data did you base this upon? That would be very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it's a great topic, and it's important. So, maybe just one thing to say at a high level, that, the reason this all matters is because from a kind of climate math perspective, the carbon dioxide emissions that we produce have a warming effect that lasts hundreds to thousands of years. So if we want any thinking around net zero, or any thinking around, removal as compensating for emissions, has to have a story for how we achieve kind of equivalent benefits that also last hundreds to thousands of years. And it's just the reality of certain interventions involving, typically biological systems, for a variety of reasons, don't have those kinds of permanence guarantees, whether it's because of physical risks like, forest burning, which of course is catastrophic for many reasons, not just the carbon, as well as changes to land management. If, say, someone agrees not to cut down their forests, and then 10 years later they change their mind, the carbon that you have removed is now lost again. So those are the reasons it's challenging, and why the permanence is sometimes lower. The way we increasingly think about it, it's really an issue of kind of risk management. And what we need to do is understand what those risks are. And really that includes both risks to permanence, as well as in some cases, additionality is itself kind of a risk. And we need to be modeling and analyzing those risks and understanding them. So I think things I showed, or the example I showed of the forest risk mapping tool, that's an example where, it's not that you shouldn't necessarily do those kinds of projects, but it might be really important to know that a forest project in one location has a sort of 5% risk of fire over the next 100 years, where in another location it has 80% chance of fire over 100 years. Mm-hmm. Those are really different outcomes in terms of the permanence of that carbon. In terms of the model, what we were really trying to do there was just put projects on a similar scale when we think about cost. So it's not that a short project or a project with short permanence is not inherently bad, but the carbon doesn't last as long. And if you want to compare the cost of a project like that to a cost of a project that is, whether through geological storage or subsurface mineral injection or something, mineralization, if you're comparing it to something that traps carbon for hundreds of thousands of years, they're not the same. And if you say one is cheap and the other is expensive, you're not comparing apples to apples. Mm-hmm. So what the tool tries to do, actually in a way that's very kind of technology and project agnostic, we don't use data from real projects. It's based on basically a simple economic model, very simple economic model. What we try to do is simply ask, if you were to do short projects, but do a lot of them, to try to, imagine just doing the same 20-year project over and over and over again, all the way through the next 1,000 years, assuming we're all around, to keep the projects going, in that situation, how much money do you end up spending? Yeah. And that's a really a key way to think about. And again, we need to manage and monitor those risks as well. It's not enough just to say you're going to keep doing it, but let's assume you can keep doing it. How much are you going to end up spending? And how does that compare to the cost of doing something permanent today? Again, it's sort of, renting the apartment versus buying. And what's so striking to us is that actually, there's, I think, a narrative right now that all projects involving sort of biological systems are so cheap. People throw around numbers like $5 a ton, $10 a ton. Yeah. And what we found by doing this kind of, again, pretty simple modeling exercise, and I don't think this was news to people necessarily, but it's pretty striking that those cheap projects actually are kind of expensive if you think about doing them at a time frame that ensures permanent benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it really makes the topic very tangible. So being able to play around the tool and seeing it move around like this, it makes it very understandable. And that's really this educational part also that you're having, and this educational role that you're bringing also to different organizations, I would say, definitely.
I appreciate that. I might also throw out on this, I think the sort of technological versus biological, I do think we have a tendency to create silos between those, and I never want to do that. These are real differences, and we have to think about them and be careful about them. There are challenges with biological systems. There are challenges with technological approaches too. When it comes to those systems, maybe permanence is less of a concern, but there's definitely a need to make sure that we're doing real things that are not just an off-ramp to continue business as usual. We need to do right by the environment. We need to do right by people and by communities. Things like using DAC for enhanced oil recovery. That's not a permanence issue, but it's an issue. And it's something that I know you all are very aware of. So I don't want to give the impression that sort of all the concerns are around sort of biological CDR. There are both opportunities and concerns on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and to reach this level, this scale that you were mentioning, even the 1 gigaton will need anyway a portfolio of solutions, and all of these solutions have their advantages and disadvantages. So that's very relevant. Yeah. So before we move into the questions, I still want to address the role of the private sector. This is a very important topic also for us working in business development, working with corporations.
Sure.
What role do you think businesses play in scaling carbon dioxide removal solutions?
Yeah, well, so there's the role they should play. Not sure what I want to say about that. The role that they are playing now, is that they're both interesting and important questions. And what we're seeing now is that there's certainly a lot of interest and excitement from the corporate world around carbon dioxide removal. We're also definitely seeing examples of organizations that are, I think, taking the issues and the problems with past approaches seriously and trying to do things that are different. I think that's really exciting. I think for companies that are willing to really wrestle with the fact that the status quo isn't working, as we've been saying, there are a lot of things to potentially do. And there are a lot of things that, if you take a lens of making sure we're spending money on high quality solutions, there's definitely a role and potentially an important role for the corporate sector to play in helping get a lot of these things off the ground. So I think, in particular, putting money towards, and I'll call it Stripe as an example of doing this, putting money towards fairly early stage projects with, an emphasis on technological progress and accelerating technological progress is valuable. And I think it's something that, it's not happening enough through other mechanisms. And the fact that companies have stepped in to try to accelerate some of this is really interesting. It's maybe not exactly what I expected, but it I think is delivering value. And I think again, it really, what matters is the criteria that a company has, and really being clear about what it's trying to achieve. And if the goal is quality and putting money towards high quality outcomes, then there's a lot that can be done. And some of it might look like sort of procurement of carbon removal. And we're certainly seeing companies trying to do that. Some of it might look more like sort of trying to accelerate early stage projects. And that looks a little more like research funding. It's kind of interesting. Definitely different than sort of procurement or purchasing of carbon removal. And I think we're seeing some exciting places where folks, again, including Stripe, or in some ways Stripe is really leading the way on this, trying to think about how to navigate that and sort of how to do both of those things maybe and sort of combine them. So yeah, I think definitely for companies that have made quantitative targets and said, we are achieving net zero, or we are achieving this goal. I think there's a challenge if companies have significant existing footprints. In the current market, it's a challenge to satisfy that with a high volume, or with high, satisfy high volumes with high quality. Companies that have not made any claims about volume are in an interesting position because they don't need to worry about that. I think we're also seeing companies that have made big claims, but are really taking the quality issue seriously and are trying to figure out how to find quality in an existing market that has a lot of challenges. And we're certainly seeing folks trying to take that seriously.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You were mentioning before the systemic approach of this whole topic, and actually the fact that companies are here also to change the status quo that what you just said is it will also require some courage, and we can see it from companies. A company like Stripe is really acting as a pioneer in this field, and from experience also. The purchase that they did last year from Climeworks Cdr is definitely something that also pushed us in the front of a scene that is very beneficial for the business development and for the business model to really establish. So it's connecting the dots in this role of the corporations. And just to address very quickly the public sector, do you see really differing roles between the private sector and the public sector here, or?
Oh, yeah, great question. Well, public sector means many things. So, one aspect of the public sector has been these compliance programs as, different from voluntary programs. So, of course, we did this kind of very, comprehensive kind of retrospective analysis of California's compliance cap and trade program and the forest offsets in that program. That's an example of doing this kind of thing in the public sector, but maybe a kind of earlier version in some ways, in many ways. The public sector and sort of compliance programs in general are interesting. In some ways they have the potential to do this kind of thing on a much larger scale. Compliance regimes in particular, and just to be clear, those are situations in which offsets are used directly to credit against emissions. There are literally polluters in the state of California that are allowed to pollute more in exchange for offset projects happening somewhere else. In those situations, if the projects aren't real, if they don't deliver real benefits, it literally, the whole system has made the problem worse. It's not just you've achieved nothing, it's actually making the climate problem worse. And that is both. So in some ways, the scale is much larger. California's program is a $2 billion market in terms of offsets. So that's a lot larger than what some of these corporate programs are now. On the other hand, we found there's a lot of problems, and a lot of those credits are not real. In our analysis, it was on the order of 30% or so of credits that basically were ghost credits or fake credits. Huge problem. So I think there's obviously a lot of interest. The fundamental kind of political economy problem of all of this is that if you have a regime in which projects are competing on volume, it's going to, and cost, it's going to drive down quality, and it turns into a race to the bottom. And that's been a particular problem in existing compliance regimes. I could imagine ways to both have much stronger standards and kind of disclosure requirements in kind of public sector implementations of these kinds of programs that could help. I can also easily imagine, much more kind of public funding on the research side. I think there's some movement in this direction. Things like, insofar as you look at a company like Stripe, not only doing procurement, but also kind of supporting early stage research, which is kind of partly what they're doing. That looks a lot like at least in the United States, I'm very familiar with, looks a lot like some government funded research programs. I think there's hints of maybe more of that coming, and that would be really exciting in the world of carbon removal. Because then we're not ready to do even 3 to 5 gigatons a year now. We need to start getting ready, and we need a lot of investment and growth and scale in order to get there. And those kinds of investments could be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Good. So I'll slowly move to the questions that we have received. I think we have received many questions, and there's actually one of the first questions which has been voted up about the price of CO2. And Toby Green is asking a general question: what should the global price of CO2 be? Do you think we should set a price on 1 ton of CO2 globally? Is it feasible?
Globally, that seems very hard. And there's a lot of work on this topic that I'm not going to be able to speak to here. I can say that whatever you think it is, it probably should be higher, and that we should be really, really skeptical of anyone anywhere who claims we're solving these problems at $5 a ton, $10 a ton. Whether we're talking about mitigation and decarbonization or the cost of carbon removal, real just is how, unfortunately, the world works. Real solutions are expensive, and doing things that are real costs more than doing things that are not real. So exactly where that puts us, I mean, that's a very complicated, or that should put us very complicated. But the thing to be most aware of is that the prices we want to be thinking about are a lot higher than probably what a lot of folks have seen, especially if they're looking at these offset programs that tell you can offset for $5 a ton. That's not real. Is it 100? Is it 200? More complicated. It's definitely a lot higher than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a really whole mindset change which has to be established within countries and within also as a consumer ourselves, that actually everything that we do, that we buy, has actually a carbon price behind. So we're not there yet, I think, but let's see. Yep. One other question that we have for businesses. So Billy Perry is asking, for a business, how do you recommend the pace of reducing operational and removal carbon offsets, one before the other, both quickly and phase down offsets as your reduction improves year on year? So how to pace this implementation of removals versus offsets?
Yeah, well, I would say, I always want to say, the number one thing globally we need to be doing is reducing our emissions and decarbonizing everything. Full stop. So that absolutely has to be the number one thing anyone is doing now. And we're not on track. And if we're going to get more and more not on track as time goes on. So we absolutely have to be doing that. So if in any way thinking about working on, offsets and removal is kind of preventing us from doing any of those other things, then that's a problem, and we can't be doing that. The reality of the climate math, again, even under really aggressive decarbonization scenarios, is that we will still need a certain scale of carbon removal. So we definitely, in quite a large scale, so we definitely want to be planning for that now. But I think it's very easy so the answer is both, but with the caveat that we can't do anything or risk anything that slows down the pace of mitigation now, or we can't risk doing anything on the side of carbon removal that sort of indirectly allows the status quo to continue to perpetuate. And I do think, with carbon removal, there are some real concerns around things like direct air capture being used for enhanced oil recovery. That could be an example of, or is an example of, carbon removal that's really allowing the status quo to continue. And that's a case where we have to be extra careful. In general, if a company is moving full throttle on, reducing its own emissions, and then in addition to that wants to put some money towards carbon removal, that's great. And they can hopefully do more and more of that over time.
Yeah, definitely. And what we often say at Climeworks, if I may, it's start small, but start today. So it's with carbon dioxide removal. So of course, reduction is the first and most important thing at the moment. And with regards to removals, we also need to really scale solutions today if we want to reach this scale of availability in the next decade.
Yep. I will also say that there's not, there might be good reasons to not link them, actually. So, if you're a company, you might say, we're going to do everything we can to reduce our footprint. Currently, whatever it is, let's just get it as small as possible. Mm-hmm. Completely separate to that. No, net zero makes sense atmospherically, but from a company's perspective, it might make more sense to say, we're going to reduce everything we can. And then separately, we have a certain amount of money and we want to put it towards good things. And we're going to put it towards the best carbon removal strategies we can, and we're going to put whatever money we have available to it today, and that can hopefully grow over time. I think definitely when you couple them, you do get in a bit of a trap where you need to achieve a certain volume of, say, credits in order to offset your emissions, and if that supply is not available, you're going to potentially end up spending money on things that aren't real. So decoupling them and basically saying, everything that we can possibly do to decarbonize and reduce our footprint. And also however much money you have. Maybe it's 100,000, maybe it's 1 million. I don't know. Depends on the company.
Yeah. But again, that's a real mindset change. We're so used to this one-to-one offsetting and having access to this $5 credit and so on. So that's
right.
Really need to change the system.
Yeah, great.
So we have one question about your Cdr database. Valerio Magliulo, how are you planning to scale the Cdr database, and will you reach out to project developers to provide information on their projects?
Great question. So there's sort of two parts to that. I'll answer the first one, or the second part, on, with product developers. It's really important that we keep kind of clean lines, and especially around information with projects. There's been a lot of issues in the past with kind of existing registries around conflicts of interest. So, we do really a lot to make sure we never learn sort of proprietary things about companies. We don't get proprietary information from companies. The information is available to all the projects because they can go to our public website and see everything we say. And there have been cases where projects have reached out. In general, if we ever change anything, we just try to be really transparent about it. So projects have pointed out we've had a typo in the materials we put on the site. We fix that and we issue a comment, and there's version control in the whole thing, so anyone can go see what we changed, and we try to explain all of our changes. Beyond that, we try not to get in situations where we're in any way biased about what we say about individual projects based on interactions we've had with projects, and we try to be really careful about that. Mm-hmm. In terms of scaling it, that's a really interesting question, and honestly, we are always open to feedback as to what would be a useful tool for the community. So, one thing is right now, the database is very much built around these proposals that are coming in through these RFPs. That's certainly not the only way that kind of carbon removal is being solicited right now. You're seeing companies that are purchasing carbon removal not through RFPs, but through other forms. So it might be interesting to start to capture some of that. We could even kind of think about sort of reorienting the database to be a little more about projects as opposed to specifically sort of these proposals that come in through RFPs. That's something we're thinking about. I can say that it's an enormous amount of work, and I want to call out in particular Freya Che on our team, who's a remarkable program associate and has really been leading our database work. It's an enormous amount of effort, and I think we're having a lot of conversations and thinking a lot about where the real value is. And what is a useful resource for the community? What do people really need? How does this help folks? And we want to understand that better and figure out how to point our own resources towards doing the most impactful thing.
Yeah. Well, we're very much looking forward to see that developing. It's really great. So time is running, and I just want to end this conversation on a hopeful note. If you had one wish, Jeremy, what would it be?
I had one wish
related to the topic, of course.
Okay, yeah. Obviously. I mean, I might say some of what we were just talking about, Celine, that you called out around, these are big mindset changes. But so on the one hand, it feels kind of daunting to think about everyone changing their mind on these topics. On the other hand, I feel we've made a lot of progress just generally with people's awareness of climate change has changed a lot in the last several years. And I feel, people's minds can change. I'm deeply optimistic about that. And I think if I had one wish, it would be that, some of these things we're talking about reorienting to really focus on making sure we are putting money towards things that are working and not putting money towards things that are not working. Mm-hmm. We all have to get on that train, so to speak. And if I could wave a wand and have that kind of be the mindset, and specifically that might include things like this decoupling we were talking about. If everyone kind of wake up and realize that's the right way to think about it, I think that'd be a big step forward. And it would mitigate some of the concerns I think we have. As excited as we are about CDR, we can't. There are risks, and especially if we slow down mitigation, that's a huge concern. Mm-hmm. So I think really having the right mindset, I believe mindsets can change. I think they're already changing on this topic. They have a lot in the recent past, and I think they can keep changing. I'd very much want to see that happen.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
What would your wish be?
Wow. What would my wish be? Well, it's really related to the day-to-day job, I would say. Really having this conscience of businesses being or realizing the role they can play actually in developing the solution. Yeah. So it's you were mentioning the role they're playing, the role that they can play, and I think it's really about looking forward and seeing how can actually business really get committed and involved in developing business models from these carbon dioxide removal solutions. So going in this direction, and that's what we're working towards at Climeworks, at least.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So thank you so much for sharing all these insights with us. It was really great to have you.
Thanks.
And I'm looking forward very much to see the platform develop in the next month and years.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me on here.
Thank you. Thank you everyone as well for joining today with us. If you liked today's event, you can look forward to our upcoming Direct Air Capture Summit. We're organizing this summit for the second time. We'll have different direct air capture organizations coming up and different carbon dioxide removal solutions actually organizations also coming up and explaining what they're doing. And we'll also have corporates saying how they're actually committing and engaging with the solutions. So you can register on this link, and we look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.